Hi, my name is Saad, and the topic of this lesson is data extraction, which means pulling data out of systems so that it can be analyzed and reports and charts can be created. This is the second lesson in Real Estate Analytics 101, and looking at this course diagram, we are at the orange dot, number 2. So getting data out of systems and making it usable for reporting and analysis actually involves not one, but 3 steps. And these are extract, transform, and load. So if you're creating reports in Excel today, you're probably already doing these 3 steps. Extracting is simply getting data out of the system, and I'm going to cover 5 ways of doing so. Exporting to CSV, using APIs, SQL, using ETL Tools, and Excel Power Query. Transforming the data means making changes to the layout of the data set and cleaning the data. So some common operations involved in transformation are pivoting and unpivoting columns, converting text fields to numbers or dates, fixing property names, charge types, account names, etc., so that they're common across each data set, and the data sets can be joined using a lookup formula. And also dealing with missing values. So for example, deciding if a blank number should be treated as a 0 or not. And then in transformation, you're also going to be dealing with outliers and bad data. For example, if the data in the source system has been entered incorrectly, you might have to do something about it after the data has been exported. And then the last part of ETL, loading, is the process of getting data into storage so that it can be pulled into your report or your dashboard. So how you do loading depends on how much data you have and how much automation you want to achieve. So the things to consider for loading data are whether you're going to load all the data or only the recently changed data. And how are you going to handle situations where like property names or GL account names or etc. have been changed. So in this case, are you going to update the historical data as well with the new names? So we're going to work with the collections data in this lesson. So let's say you've been asked to prepare this collections report each week. It is showing receivables and collections aggregated by property. So your executive team wants to know how many occupied units there are, how much balance is outstanding, how much has been paid, and what % of residents have a balance greater than 30 days. So if your property management system already has a report like this, there wouldn't be any work to do. But let's assume that that perfect report doesn't exist. So you're going to have to create it. So the first thing to ask is, where is this data going to come from? So depending on what system you're using, you might have to run a variety of reports. The balance greater than 30 days will have to come from the accounts receivables aging report. The number of occupied units and vacant units can be pulled from the rent roll. And then the amount charged and amount paid can be pulled from several different reports, including the rent roll. So let's build our collection summary using the AR aging and the rent roll. So now that you know where to get the data from, let's go ahead and export it. Let's manually create the report, and later I'll show you several options for automating the process. So to extract, we'll simply go into the system, run the report with the right parameters, and then export to Excel. We have to do this twice, once for the AR aging and once for the rent roll. So here's what the data looks like. So this is the AR aging output, and this is the rent roll output. Now, as you can see, neither data set is in a pivot table ready format. There are blank rows and subtotal rows and more. So the extract step is complete, and now we go to the transform step. So transformation is reshaping the data so that it can be joined to another data set on certain columns, or pulled into a dashboard, or pulled into a pivot table. So here are a few transformations that need to be performed on our collections data. Let's look at the rent roll. So as exported, the rent roll shows each individual resident, so it will need to be summarized. Also, the property name isn't even a column, it's in a separator row, and we'll have to put it into a column in each row. I can also see there are subtotal rows here, and these also need to be removed. So the AR aging export looks even more complicated. It has a lot of blank rows, and then the number of rows per resident isn't the same, and it depends on how many charge types there are. And we also have subtotals. So we'll have to unpivot this in order to make it usable for our collections report. So pivoting and unpivoting is a type of transformation. Here you see how the AR aging buckets are in columns. So these need to be unpivoted so that we only have one column for amount and one column for the age, because these numbers are additive. And that is, the total AR is the sum of the amounts in each of these aging buckets. So aggregation is another type of transformation. So for example, in this rent roll, the grain of the data is each month, each resident. Since we are only interested in reporting by month and property, we would need to sum up the resident activity for each month. There's usually no need to save this aggregated data separately because the aggregation can be calculated on the fly when you're generating your report, unless you have a lot of data and the computing power is limited. In that case, it would be useful to create another file that contains one row for each property with the totals already calculated. The next transformation to consider is cleaning the data. That is, you might have to fix property names, or deal with missing values, deal with outliers, or convert text columns to numbers or to dates. So after we're done with transformation, we want the AR aging data to look like this, and the rent roll summary to look like this. So the third step in ETL is loading. Since we're currently building this report manually, loading simply involves saving the transformed data where it can be pulled into a dashboard. What if you have to perform this step once a week and you already have many months of transformed data sitting somewhere? So you'll need to append the latest data to the existing data set. That's called an incremental load. You'll be incrementing the number of rows in an existing data set. Now, if a GL account name or a property name has changed, then you'll need a way to make sure that the historical data and the new data can be tied together. So this is what's involved in loading. It will make more sense when we look at automating the loading process with large volumes of data. So once you've got your data set, creating the report is simple. You can set up an Excel sheet that uses VLOOKUPs and SUMIFs and populates the latest data in the cells. And it can also be done in a pivot table. Or we can build it out in Power BI or Tableau and then display the information in a dashboard. So what I showed to you is probably not new. You're already doing this, but you don't have to keep doing it this way manually. This can all be automated. So you can spend more time understanding the data and deciding what to do with the information instead of spending energy manually preparing the data. Now let's look at automation and the tools that are available. So there are 5 methods for getting data out of the systems, and I'll go into each one now. So exporting to CSV, which we've already done, APIs, direct SQL queries, ETL tools, and finally, Excel Power Query. Power Query is something I would like you to know about. So the number one method, exporting to Excel or CSV, you all know how to do that. Most systems allow you to automate that. For example, you can create a report that contains all the columns that you need, and then schedule it to run at a specific time and have it emailed to you. Most likely, you have this option available, and at least you can receive the data file automatically in your inbox instead of logging into the system and running the report manually. So number 2, direct SQL query. So all the systems, or almost all the systems, store their data in a SQL database. Some allow you to pull data out directly from the database. So you can do this with Rent Manager. You can also do this with Yardi, or at least a copy of the Yardi database. So the data is extracted using SQL commands, and writing SQL queries against the system tables does require some advanced knowledge. However, there are people who specialize in this. One might already be working in your company, and you can also hire consultants to do this. So many of the transformations and joins that I showed you previously can all be avoided. So depending on how the SQL query is written, you'll get the columns you need from both the AR aging and the rent roll, and all aggregated at the property level. So the next method, and my preferred method, is to use an API. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and this means that instead of logging into the system from the front end and to fetch the data, you can fetch the data via a program using an API call. So even if you're not very technical and have never coded, you probably can take advantage of APIs. I'll start here with an overview and then show you where in Excel you can make an API call to fetch data. So some companies such as Entrata and Rent Manager make their APIs available to customers. So other companies such as Yardi and AppFolio offer the API on a very selective and limited basis. So why are APIs my preferred method? Because of their simplicity. APIs enable you to pull data out of the system without actually logging into the front end. So in the case of Rent Viewer, we've written connectors to many different systems, and these programs wake up on a schedule, they connect to our customers' data through their APIs, and extract the latest data. So you probably haven't made an API call yourself, but it's pretty straightforward. In fact, you can do it from Excel. So in Excel, go to Data, Get Data from Web, and in that dialog, you'll type in a URL for the API and the data that you're trying to pull. So formatting the URL requires some knowledge, but the information is publicly available. For example, Entrata's API documentation can be found at docs.entrata.com. Here are examples of how you would format the URL for specific data sets. So APIs are very powerful, and as a data analyst, it'll be worth your time to explore them. So the fourth method of pulling data out of systems that I'm going to mention are called ETL Tools. So these are specialized tools built specifically for this purpose, for extracting, transforming, and loading data. They have names like Informatica, Alteryx, and SQL Server Integration Services. So Tableau's ETL tool is called Tableau Prep. So these tools allow you to create a flowchart. And each step in the flowchart, you can perform an operation, such as pivoting, unpivoting, converting text columns to dates and numbers, and much more. So here are some examples of user interfaces of these tools. So the last tool I'd like to cover here is Power Query. You already have it, but probably don't know much about it. Power Query is not a full-fledged ETL tool, but it is very powerful and useful in many situations. So let's take a look. So fire up Excel, and this is how you start Power Query. So the accounts receivable and the rent roll data that we converted into the pivot table ready format earlier in this lesson, that can also be done in Power Query. So this is the Power Query editor. And on the right side here in the panel are the various transformation steps we did. So take the time to learn Power Query. It can save you a lot of time. So this has been a long lesson. Hope you found it useful and can apply these ideas in your job. Please get in touch with me if you have any questions. Leave a comment on this video, and I invite you to follow Rent Viewer on LinkedIn. Our next lesson is going to be on data storage. I will discuss ways to store your data so that you have a single version of the truth, so that you and your coworkers can use the same transformed data for your models and your reports. And I'll also introduce data warehouses. So thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next lesson.